Welcome back to movingprofessional.com. So this video is in response to a comment I got from Brian on a video regarding hip shifting that I had done. And he wanted to know, when you're hip shifting, is the hip going into internal rotation or external rotation? And I thought that was a very good question, and I think it's a complex question. In my understanding, it could be both. So I just want to use the model, so that's why we're here at the desk at first, just to use the pelvic model to just demonstrate the difference between internal and external rotation from the center out, using the pelvis as a reference. So if I grab the pelvis here and we look at it from the front, and it's helpful to have a nice flexible moving pelvis, what we're going to get is a sense of, here's your sacrum, and here's the two ilium. And when we think about internal rotation, what we're going to think about is that the ilium come together on the front side here. So these bones, your ASIS, they're going to come towards each other, and it's going to tend to happen on an exhale. So we think about the abdominals being in front here. You're exhaling, your belly button's moving inward, and then that's moving the pelvis inward on the front here. And then you can see where the hip is down here, the acetabulum or the socket. So as you are exhaling and you're compressing the top part of the pelvis there, you'll get the acetabulum to move into internal rotation. So that's key, because depending on our intention, we could be exhaling and compressing our abdomen, making our abdominals tight, and that would be pulling the hip into the socket in a more internal rotation orientation. So if I'm just sitting here right now, and let's just use the pelvis again and say my hips are to about a 90-degree angle. So let's see if I can maneuver this. So we're 90 degrees here, and I want to just pull my left hip into the socket. So if my left hip comes a little bit more inward, so I'm pulling inward, and I do that by exhaling, and I'm closing down on this ilium by engaging my abdomen, I'm going to be going into more internal rotation. It would still feel or look like the thigh is moving inward relative to the other thigh, but that would be more internal rotation. Now, where it becomes more external rotation will be if I'm standing up and I'm trying to load a leg as if I'm going to then take off from that leg. So loading before cutting, loading in a backswing before coming through and propelling through a golf swing. And what that's going to look like with the pelvis would be, I'm still going to be rotating, and now I'm going to be having this pelvis flare out a little bit, and that's going to be on an inhale. So typically when we think about loading, we can also breathe in at this point, and then as we come through and make contact with a golf ball, or even if we're loading to throw a punch, the propulsive phase tends to be when we're exhaling. So that would be where the internal rotation is. But as I'm setting up and I'm basically loading the slingshot to come forward, that would be more external rotation. And again, that looks like this on the pelvis, where we're actually opening this up. And a good way to think about this is if we can see the trochanter here of the femur. So if I am coming back and loading it, the trochanter will actually come back with me. So that would be more external rotation. The ilium tends to open up, the trochanter tends to go that way. If I'm exhaling and I'm closing down on the ilium here, so I'll hold that in place, that tends to bring the socket of the hip with it, and then that's going to bring the trochanter a little bit forward. All right, but both of them can be considered a hip shift. It just depends on what my intention is. So a lot of times we'll do the more compressive, internally oriented hip shift when we are really just trying to feel those relationships of muscles. We're trying to feel that the referencing of muscles to say, okay, I want to get a little bit more internal rotation. So a lot of times it's going to be the internal obliques on the side we're trying to internally rotate towards. It'll be the adductors. And then you might actually feel the outer hip where some of your internal rotators are. But it's going to be a compressive movement. You're not really trying to load the hip too much. You're maybe trying to shift your weight over to one side, but it's not load and explode at that point. The torso will tend to also be a little bit more upright when we're going into internal rotation. So I'm going to show these movements in the gym just so you can see the difference and feel the difference. But when you are about to load your hip, typically you're going to go into a little bit more of a forward trunk lean, and that's going to create a little bit more of an external rotation. But when you're more upright, say you pause and you're working on some of the phases of gait and your torso is a little bit more upright, the leg that you're on may go into a little bit more internal rotation. If you want to be compressive with it and say pull it into the socket, you'll feel adductors, you'll feel abs, but you're actively trying to kind of squeeze the musculature at that point, as opposed to shifting yourself and loading the hip. So we'll go out to the gym and we'll take a look at these movements to hopefully make a little bit more sense of it.
All right, so now let's look at a couple examples that I was discussing in the office there. So if we're just sitting, you can just see that the feet are planted, the knees are even. A hip shift that's more compressive and would be more internally rotated would be, I'm just going to think about pulling my heel back into the ground. I'm going to engage my hamstring, and then I'm going to feel my inner thigh. And the key is that I have to be exhaling. So I'm going to take an inhale first, but as I exhale, I'm going to squeeze in my belly button. I'm going to feel the internal obliques engage. And then just imagine, if you can visualize the pelvic model, that this ilium is rotating inward. So that's going to create a relative internal rotation on this hip. So this leg is heavy. I'm more into the sit bone on this side. This leg is light. So that would be a hip shift into internal rotation here. And I could feel the trochanter from where I started move slightly forward and inward, right? But the key is the exhale and the use of the breath. So if I just shift like that and my knee comes back, that's actually external rotation because my pelvis keeps going. I'm not doing anything to hold it in place, so I'm not using my internal obliques to hold it in place. I'm not creating that exhale, which will smush my pelvis from the front to create a little bit more internal rotation on that left side. So in sitting, I can create an external rotation or an internal rotation depending on how I'm breathing and depending on what my intention is. So if I want to create this more external, and this could be valuable just to get a sense of, in sitting, how to load a hip, automatically you can start to see my arms shift into a more athletic position, like I'm loading this hip. I'm not creating much in the effect of trying to engage any muscles. I'm just trying to shift. I don't want my knee to go out. I still want to keep the same plane of coming in. And I still might feel the adductors here. But because I'm not engaging and trying to stay upright and having my pelvis roll in, it's going to be more of an external rotation. And I can already feel here is if I wanted to jump up from here, I'm more loaded on the side to allow for some rotation. So in standing, what that would look like is if I'm just working on, say, pausing in some of the cycles of gait. So here I'm in a heel strike. If I wanted to get a little bit more internally rotated on this hip, I'm going to exhale and I'm going to sort of suck this into the socket. I'll feel my adductors turn on. I'm heavy in the heel. And then I want to make sure I'm exhaling and feeling these abs really turn on, which will then pull that pelvis, that ilium a little bit more forward and compress it. So that compression creates a little bit more of an internal rotation moment. But if I want to load this hip, say I'm going to cut, I'm going to come back to here. Now this knee is still back relative to this one. This leg is still heavy. This one's still light. But now I'm propelling, I'm loading it in order to propel off of it. So this is loading the slingshot. This is just pausing and feeling the compression, using the muscles to pull yourself into a little bit of internal rotation. Both have their value, both depending on the intent. Just it's good to know the difference. And oftentimes, from a practical sense, they help each other. So just being able to feel the feeling of pulling into the socket and feeling the adductors compressively can then help, okay, as I'm going into this more loaded position, often a compensation is to keep going and kick the hip that way. I want to go straight back. That's going to be a similar feeling. I'm still going to feel this adductor. It's just now because I've come into this position where I'm loading this hip to explode, it just happens to be more external rotation, and I'm going to be more inhaled to try to prepare for the exhale as I explode. All right, so they are sort of superimposed on each other, and they can be utilized with a lot of the same cueing. The big difference being, am I exhaling to pull myself into it, or am I inhaling to absorb the load before I explode? Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, you can go to movementprofessional.com. I'll see you next time.